Thank you. Okay.
Okay. Rory Kennedy, director of Last Days in Vietnam. There have been countless documentaries made about the war in Vietnam. Talk about what made this particular story unique and worth making a film about.
Well, I think there are a lot of reasons. It's a compelling story. I think it's a very dramatic story, and I think there's also a lot of lessons that we can learn from this story. This was 40 years ago, April 29th, 1975, but there are many echoes of what's happening today with Iraq and Afghanistan, our engagements with ISIS, and I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned about what happened 40 years ago and how to not get out of a war. I think the film is an important reminder of the human cost of war. I think it's also, there are a lot of lessons about getting out of a war, our commitment to the people on the ground, what happens to them when we leave. And I think it's a dramatic story in this really important chapter in American history that very few people know about. That has been the overwhelming response to people who come see the film in theaters. They say, "I can't believe I didn't know this story." And so I think it's an engaging story. I think it's an important story, and it's relevant today.
Right. Well, let's talk a bit about what that story is, because this is, as the title indicates, it's about our last days in Vietnam, when the U.S. military was trying to extract the citizens of Saigon out of a very dangerous territory, as well as all the U.S. military personnel. I've got that correct, right?
That is correct. Yes, I'm nodding. Yes.
Right. Okay. So a lot went wrong with that, as you portray in the film.
Yes. I think, in 2 years prior to the events that are shown in our film, we had signed the Paris Peace Accord. So the war was ostensibly over. America had about 6,000 or 7,000 personnel on the ground who were there to really keep the peace. They worked at the embassy, they were Marines, but there was no longer military personnel, people who were fighting in the fields. And the idea was that there would be a peace treaty between the North and the South. The North broke the peace treaty. They came down to the South. They thought it would take, estimated, 2 years to get to Saigon. But the country fell like a house of cards. And by 4 months later, by April, they were in Saigon. They were outside of the city gates. And so the U.S. was really largely caught off guard. We didn't have a proper evacuation plan in place. There wasn't a methodical approach to how are we going to evacuate the Vietnamese who worked with us, how are we going to get the Americans out. And then added to that, the airport was bombed that evening, and then we were told we have 24 hours to get out of the country. So we could no longer evacuate through the airport, which is why I think a lot of people are familiar with the image of the helicopter and what we think is the embassy. It actually isn't the embassy, as the film reveals, but that we had to do an emergency evacuation ultimately out of the embassy, a few other parts of the city, to try to get as many Americans out as possible, which was largely the U.S. policy. But what our film shows is how these heroic Americans and South Vietnamese went against U.S. policy, risked their lives, arguably, to save as many South Vietnamese as possible. You know, it's a great story, and I think an important story, because it's in this moment, I think, kind of one of the worst moments in at least in the last 100 years in American history. In terms of U.S. policy, it was a real abandonment of the U.S. towards the Vietnamese who were left behind. But yet the film shows these men on the ground who did the right thing, and they risked their lives. They really did what they could to get as many Vietnamese out as possible. It's a story that very few people are familiar with. The idea that they're heroes, American heroes that came out of Vietnam, is something that this film shows for many people for the first time, I think. And I think in that way, it's really touched a nerve for folks, because it is this chapter shown in a light that has, for many people, never been seen before.
Right. Can you talk a bit about finding your subjects? Were you met with any resistance by anybody, or did you have trouble tracking anybody down to talk about the in the film?
Well, we did. I mean, it was challenging for sure. There were a lot of people who, this was a very tumultuous time. It was a very difficult time, particularly for people who are on the front lines. And I think that it's very hard for them to revisit this. Many of the people I interviewed told me it would take them 3 or 4 days, if not longer, to recover just from the interview. So I think it was a lot to ask of people. One of the bigger challenges was finding the Vietnamese voices who, which was really, really important to me to understand exactly what was at stake, what it meant to be left behind. And we ultimately, I think, interviewed some really extraordinary people whose stories, I think, are really at the heart of our film. Kissinger is in the film. He was resistant to participating at first. Ultimately came around, but he took some convincing for sure. Mm-hmm. And then, I would say another challenge with the film is the archive, to just, help people really transport themselves to Saigon 40 years ago, and to tell that part of the story in a visual manner was certainly a big challenge. But we got very lucky with that, and ultimately have a lot of footage in there that's never been seen before and is extraordinarily dramatic.
Right, and can you talk a bit more about that? Because there's this amazing footage throughout the entire film of the chaos that's ensuing, and you've got all these striking photographs as well. Where did you find all this stuff?
Well, we had a great graphics team who went into the archive houses, ABC, NBC, CBS, to get the source material, so we weren't just using the footage that people may have seen on television, maybe in the immediate aftermath of the war, or in some of the documentaries that have been done on Vietnam. So I think in that way we found footage consistent throughout the film that is new and original. But we also got very lucky. I had come to know a guy named Jan Herman who ran the historical preservation unit at the U.S. Department of the Navy, and he helped uncover the story of the USS Kirk, which is a story that plays a significant role in our film. It's a ship that was protecting out on the South China Sea. It was protecting the U.S. fleet out there, and ended up taking an unexpected role in the evacuation of the South Vietnamese. And it turned out that there was a sailor who was on that ship, and Jan Herman had met him a few months before. When I talked to Jan about our film and how I wanted to focus on the story of the U.S. Kirk in our film, he said, this guy I met with, he mentioned that he had just gone up to his attic and there was a box of Super 8 undeveloped footage that was sitting there, and it said, 1975 U.S. Kirk. Would I have any interest in that? And so I said, yes, I would have a lot of interest in that. Thank you very much. Oh. I called him, ended up flying him out to LA, and we transferred this footage, and it was just a treasure trove of really, some of the more dramatic moments that are revealed in the film, and he really captures that. We ended up using, I think, about 12 minutes of his footage in the film, which, as you know, it doesn't sound like that much, but is a huge chunk of time.
Right. Now, and once you've got all this footage assembled and you've conducted all these interviews, how do you begin to construct them into a narrative for your film?
Well, I would say that was probably the biggest challenge of making this film was the edit. We don't use a narrator in the film. We don't use any historians. It's all first-hand accounts of what happened in real time. We use very few cards. And so it's really coming from the voice of the people who were there, who were on the front lines. The way the film is told, people say it's like watching a thriller. What's going to happen next? It's a ticking time bomb situation. And that's really what I wanted to accomplish. So as they're telling the events as they unfold, we don't know anything more than they knew in that moment. And so the film doesn't have kind of the word of God that takes you out of the moment and says, well, in fact, he was wrong about this, or, you know, you just see the events unfold as though you're in Saigon in 1975. And I think in that way, you know, my hope is that it really transports people back to this moment. And I think ultimately that's the power of film, is that you can feel the emotion, you can experience it almost as, you know, it's virtual, but it can make you understand why certain decisions were made and how we got into these situations. And, you know, in this case, the real heroism that was at hand.
Right. Could you talk a bit about Ambassador Martin, who is sort of a central figure in this film and sort of a complex individual as well as portrayed in the film?
Yeah, well, he was a fascinating character, and this is part of the reason why I like to do feature films, is that we were really able, I think, to capture the nuance of his character in this film. Because, of course, in the beginning, you know, people think that he's the villain of the film, he's the ambassador, he refuses to accept the idea that Saigon is falling, and therefore he refuses to put in an evacuation plan. There's, you know, as a result of that, there were people on the ground who started these black ops trying to get people out under the radar of the ambassador, so he wasn't aware of it. There was one instance when he found out about somebody doing that, he fired them. And then, you know, but then when the airport is bombed and there's no longer any possibility that Saigon is going to be saved, they send a helicopter to the embassy, and the first person who's supposed to get on that helicopter is the ambassador. And it's a direct order for the ambassador to leave, and he refuses to get on the helicopter. And he commits himself to put as many Vietnamese in those helicopters as possible, and he knows that as soon as all the Americans are gone, then they're going to stop the evacuation. And so he is putting Vietnamese after Vietnamese in these helicopters, and he stays there until he gets a presidential order at 3:45 in the morning. He has to leave. When you get a presidential order, it's very hard to say no to that. So I understand he gets on that helicopter, and then soon after they stop the airlift. But I think it reveals, you know, it goes back to that famous saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And I think that, you know, what ultimately we understand about the ambassador is that he did have good intentions. I think he really cared about Vietnam. He had lost a son in the war, and he was really committed to keeping Vietnam and South Vietnam as it was. He's committed to the people there, and he couldn't see and envision it falling.
Mm-hmm. Right. You know, there's a real tragedy at the end about the people who got left behind when the ambassador was finally forced to leave and the last few Americans were extracted from Vietnam. Can you talk a bit about that?
Well, you know, it is certainly a tragic moment, and I think that is really ultimately, you know, the film really shows these heroes for sure, but it doesn't shy away from the fact that this was a dark moment in our history, and certainly a very difficult one for the Vietnamese who were left behind. And I think there was, you know, real anxiety and real fear, and I think a lot of that was justified about being left behind. Many of the Vietnamese who were left behind ended up spending years and years in re-education camps, which was basically hard labor. Many of them were tortured and killed. And, you know, and part of the tragedy of this film that it shows is that we didn't have a proper evacuation plan. Of course, there were these great Americans and Vietnamese who did what they could to save as many Vietnamese as possible. But because it wasn't methodical, we didn't necessarily get out the people who were at highest risk and who had worked tirelessly and side by side with the U.S. government in fighting that war. And so those people ended up being the most vulnerable and facing the greatest consequence. And that's part of, to me, what the lesson is of this moment in history, and the value of it. Because I think sometimes when we're talking about Iraq and Afghanistan and ISIS, we forget what it means to leave those places and what the implications are to our allies. You know, it might be the people we worked with on a military level, but it might also be the cooks and the translators. You know, anybody who's associated with us, we can move on, but they end up facing the real consequence. You know, there's a character in our film named Dam Pham, the wonderful Vietnamese who worked with the U.S. government, worked with some companies, was, you know, assured that he would get out. He didn't get out, and he wasn't given the assistance to leave, and he ended up spending 13 years in a re-education camp. You know, so I think that it's important to remember the Dam Phams of the world, and it's important to think through that responsibility when we enter these wars. What happens when we leave, and what is our responsibility to the people on the ground when we go, and what happens to them? It's not just about going in and, you know, doing a military operation and leaving. So I think it's, you know, in that way I feel like it's a very timely story and very relevant today.
Right, right. Well, thank you so much, and congratulations on the film.
Well, thank you. It's great talking to you. I appreciate you giving it some attention.
Oh, of course. Thank you.
Okay. You take care.
You too. Bye now.